Background and early life. Booth's parents, the noted British Shakespearean actor Junius Brutus Booth and his mistress Mary Ann Holmes, came to the United States from England in June 1821. 3. They purchased a 150-acre, 61-ha, farm near Bel Air in Harford County, Maryland, where John Wilkes Booth was born in a 4-room log house on May 10, 1838, the ninth of 10 children. 4. He was named after the English radical politician John Wilkes, a distant relative. 5. 6. Junius Brutus Booth's wife, Adelaide Delanoy Booth, was granted a divorce in 1851 on grounds of adultery, and Holmes legally wed John Wilkes Booth's father on May 10, 1851, the youth's 13th birthday. 7. Nora Titton, in her book My Thoughts Be Bloody, recounts how the shame and ambition of Junius Brutus Booth's 2 illegitimate actor sons, Edwin and John Wilkes Booth, would eventually spur them to strive, as rivals, for achievement and acclaim. Edwin, a Unionist, and John Wilkes, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. 8. The same year, 1851, that Booth's father married Holmes, he built Tudor Hall on the Harford County property as the family's summer home, while also maintaining a winter residence on Exeter Street in Baltimore in the 1840s, 1850s. 9, 10, 11, Tudor Hall. In 1865 as a boy, John Wilkes Booth was athletic and popular, becoming skilled at horsemanship and fencing. 12. A sometimes indifferent student, he attended the Bel Air Academy, where the headmaster described him as not deficient in intelligence, but disinclined to take advantage of the educational opportunities offered him. Each day he rode back and forth from farm to school, taking more interest in what happened along the way than in reaching his classes on time. 13. 14. In 1850-1851, he attended the Quaker-run Milton boarding school for boys located in Sparks, Maryland, and later St. Timothy's Hall, an Episcopal military academy in Catonsville, Maryland, beginning when he was 13 years old. 15. At the Milton School, students recited such classical works as those by Herodotus, Cicero, and Tacitus. 16. 17. Students at St. Timothy's wore military uniforms and were subject to a regimen of daily formation drills and strict discipline. 18. Booth left school at 14, after his father's death. 19. While attending the Milton boarding school, Booth met a gypsy fortune-teller who read his palm and pronounced a grim destiny, telling Booth that he would have a grand but short life, doomed to die young and meeting a bad end. 20. His sister recalled that Booth wrote down the palm reader's prediction and showed it to his family and others, often discussing its portents in moments of melancholy in later years. 21. As recounted by Booth's sister, Asia Booth Clark, in her memoirs written in 1874, no one church was preeminent in the Booth household. Booth's mother was Episcopalian and his father was described as a free spirit, preferring a Sunday walk along the Baltimore waterfront with his children to attending church. On January 23, 1853, the 14-year-old Booth was finally baptized at St. Timothy's Protestant Episcopal Church. 20. Later in life, Booth became a Roman Catholic, possibly converted by his sister, Asia Booth Clark. 22. 23. By the age of 16, Booth was interested in the theater and in politics, becoming a delegate from Bel Air to a rally by the Know Nothing Party for Henry Winter Davis, the anti-immigrant party's candidate for Congress in the 1854 elections. 24. Aspiring to follow in the footsteps of his father and his actor brothers Edwin and Junius Brutus, Jr., Booth began practicing elocution daily in the woods around Tudor Hall and studying Shakespeare. Theatrical career. 1850s. The Richmond Theater, Richmond, Virginia, in 1858, when Booth made his first stage appearance there at age 17, Booth made his stage debut on August 14, 1855, in the supporting role of the Earl of Richmond in Richard III at Baltimore's Charles Street Theater. 26-27 The audience hissed at the inexperienced actor when he missed some of his lines. 26. 28 He also began acting at Baltimore's Holiday Street Theater, owned by John T. Ford, where the Booths had performed frequently. 29 In 1857, Booth joined the stock company of the Arch Street Theater in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he played for a full season. 30 At his request he was billed as J.B. Wilkes, a pseudonym meant to avoid comparison with other members of his famous thespian family. 26. 31 Author Jim Bishop wrote that Booth developed into an outrageous scene stealer, but he played his parts with such heightened enthusiasm that the audiences idolized him. 28 In February 1858, he played in Lucrezia Borgia at the Arch Street Theater. On opening night, he experienced stage fright and stumbled over his line. Instead of introducing himself by saying, "Madam, I am Petruchio Pandolfo," he stammered, "Madam, I am Pandolfio Pet Pandolfio Pet dammit. Who am I?" causing the audience to roar with laughter. 26-32 Later that year, Booth played the part of an Indian, Uncas, in a play staged in Petersburg, Virginia, and then became a stock company actor at the Richmond Theater in Virginia, where he became increasingly popular with audiences for his energetic performances. 33 On October 5, 1858, Booth played the part of Horatio in Hamlet, with his older brother Edwin having the title role. Afterward, Edwin led the younger Booth to the theater's footlights and said to the audience, "I think he's done well, don't you?" In response, the audience applauded loudly and cried yes. Yes. 33 In all, John Wilkes performed in 83 plays in 1858. Among them were William Wallace and Brutus, having as their theme the killing or overthrow of an unjust ruler. 34 Booth said that of all Shakespearean characters, his favorite role was Brutus, the slayer of a tyrant. 35 Some critics called Booth the handsomest man in America and a natural genius and noted his having an astonishing memory. Others were mixed in their estimation of his acting. 35-36 He stood 5 feet 8 inches number 1.73 m number tall, had jet black hair, and was lean and athletic. 37 Noted Civil War reporter George Alfred Townsend described him as a muscular, perfect man, with curling hair, like a Corinthian capital. 38 Booth's stage performances were often characterized by his contemporaries as acrobatic and intensely physical, leaping upon the stage and gesturing with passion. 37-39 He was an excellent swordsman, although a fellow actor once recalled that he occasionally cut himself with his own sword. 37 Historian Benjamin Platt Thomas wrote that Booth won celebrity with theatergoers by his romantic personal attraction, but that he was too impatient for hard study and his brilliant talents had failed a full development. 39 Author Gene Smith wrote that Booth's acting may not have been as precise as his brother Edwin's, but his strikingly handsome appearance enthralled women. 40 As the 1850s drew to a close, Booth was becoming wealthy as an actor, earning $20,000 a year number equivalent to about $517,000 today number. 41 1860s After finishing the 1859-1860 theater season in Richmond, Virginia, Booth embarked on his first national tour as a leading actor. He engaged a Philadelphia attorney, Matthew Canning, to serve as his agent. 42 By mid-1860, he was playing in such cities as New York, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, Columbus, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, and New Orleans. 28-43 Poet and journalist Walt Whitman said of Booth's acting, "He would have flashes, passages, I thought of real genius." 44 The Philadelphia Press drama critic said, "Without having his brother Edwin's culture and grace, Mr. Booth has far more action, more life, and, we are inclined to think, more natural genius." 44 Boston Museum Playbill advertising booth in Romeo and Juliet, May 3, 1864. When the Civil War began on April 12, 1861, Booth was starring in Albany, New York. His outspoken admiration for the South's secession, publicly calling it heroic, so enraged local citizens that they demanded his banning from the stage for making treasonable statements. 45. Albany's drama critics were kinder, however, giving him rave reviews. One called him a genius, praising his acting for never failing to delight with his masterly impressions. 46. As the Civil War raged across the divided land in 1862, Booth appeared mostly in Union and border states. In January, he played the title role in Richard III in St. Louis and then made his Chicago debut. In March, he made his first acting appearance in New York City. 47. In May 1862, he made his Boston debut, playing N. Business ventures. Booth invested some of his growing wealth in various enterprises during the early 1860s, including land speculation in Boston's Back Bay section. 61. He also started a business partnership with John Elsler, manager of the Cleveland Academy of Music, and another friend, Thomas Mears, to develop oil wells in northwestern Pennsylvania, where an oil boom had started in August 1859, following Edwin Drake's discovery of oil there. 62. Initially calling their venture Dramatic Oil, later renaming it Fuller Farm Oil No. The partners invested in a 31.5-acre No. 12.7 Ha site along the Allegheny River at Franklin, Pennsylvania, in late 1863 for drilling. 62. By early 1864, they had a producing 1,900-foot No. 579 m No. deep oil well, named Wilhelmina for Mears' wife, yielding 25 barrels No. 4 kl number of crude oil daily, then considered a good yield. The Fuller Farm Oil Company was selling shares with a prospectus featuring the well-known actor's celebrity status as Mr. J. Wilkes Booth, a successful and intelligent operator in oil lands, it said. 62. The partners, impatient to increase the well's output, attempted the use of explosives, which wrecked the well and ended production. Booth, already growing more obsessed with the South's worsening situation in the Civil War and angered at Lincoln's re-election, withdrew from the oil business on November 27, 1864, with a substantial loss of his $6,000 number $81,400 in $2,010 number investment. Civil War years. Strongly opposed to the abolitionists who sought to end slavery in the U.S., Booth attended the hanging on December 2, 1859, of abolitionist leader John Brown, who was executed for leading a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, in present-day West Virginia. 64. Booth had been rehearsing at the Richmond Theater when he abruptly decided to join the Richmond Greys, a volunteer militia of 1,500 men traveling to Charlestown for Brown's hanging, to guard against an attempt by abolitionists to rescue Brown from the gallows by force. 64. 65. When Brown was hanged without incident, Booth stood in uniform near the scaffold and afterwards expressed great satisfaction with Brown's fate, although he admired the condemned man's bravery in facing death stoically. 44. 66. Lincoln was elected president on November 6, 1860, and the following month Booth drafted a long speech, apparently undelivered, that decried Northern abolitionism and made clear his strong support of the South and the institution of slavery. 67. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War began, and eventually 11 Southern states seceded from the Union. In Booth's native Maryland, the slave-holding portion of the population favored joining the Confederate States of America. Because the threatened secession of Maryland would leave the federal capital of Washington, D.C., an indefensible enclave within the Confederacy, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and imposed martial law in Baltimore and portions of the state, ordering the imprisonment of pro-secession Maryland political leaders at Fort McHenry and the stationing of federal troops in Baltimore. 68. Although Maryland remained in the Union, newspaper editorials and many Marylanders, including Booth, agreed with Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's decision in Ex parte Merryman that Lincoln's actions were unconstitutional. 69. As a popular actor in the 1860s, he continued to travel extensively to perform in the North and South, and as far west as New Orleans, Louisiana. According to his sister Asia, Booth confided to her that he also used his position to smuggle quinine to the South during his travels there, helping the Confederacy obtain the needed drug despite the Northern blockade. 61. Lucy Lambert Hale, Booth's fiancée in 1865. Although Booth was pro-Confederate, his family, like many Marylanders, was divided. He was outspoken in his love of the South, and equally outspoken in his hatred of Lincoln. 55. 70. As the Civil War went on, Booth increasingly quarreled with his brother Edwin, who declined to make stage appearances in the South and refused to listen to John Wilkes' fiercely partisan denunciations of the North and Lincoln. 61. In early 1863, Booth was arrested in St. Louis while on a theater tour, when he was heard saying he wished the president and the whole damned government would go to hell. 71. 72. Charged with making treasonous remarks against the government, he was released when he took an oath of allegiance to the Union and paid a substantial fine. In February 1865, Booth became infatuated with Lucy Lambert Hale, the daughter of U.S. Senator John P. Hale of New Hampshire, and they became secretly engaged when Booth received his mother's blessing for their marriage plans. "You have so often been dead in love," his mother counseled Booth in a letter, "be well assured she is really and truly devoted to you." 73. Booth composed a handwritten Valentine card for his fiancée on February 13, expressing his adoration. She was unaware of Booth's deep antipathy towards President Lincoln. 73. Plot to kidnap Lincoln. As the 1864 presidential election drew near, the Confederacy's prospects for victory were ebbing and the tide of war increasingly favored the North. The likelihood of Lincoln's re-election filled Booth with rage towards the president, whom Booth blamed for the war and all the South's troubles. Booth, who had promised his mother at the outbreak of war that he would not enlist as a soldier, increasingly chafed at not fighting for the South, writing in a letter to her, "I have begun to deem myself a coward and to despise my own existence." 74. He began to formulate plans to kidnap Lincoln from his summer residence at the Old Soldiers' Home, 3 miles number 5 kilometers number from the White House, and to smuggle him across the Potomac River into Richmond. Once in Confederate hands, Lincoln would be exchanged for the release of Confederate Army prisoners of war held captive in northern prisons, and, Booth reasoned, bring the war to an end by emboldening opposition to the war in the North or forcing Union recognition of the Confederate government. 74, 75, 76, 77. Throughout the Civil War, the Confederacy maintained a network of underground operators in southern Maryland, particularly Charles and St. Mary's counties, smuggling recruits across the Potomac River into Virginia and relaying messages for Confederate agents as far north as Canada. 78. Booth recruited his Assassination of Lincoln. Main article, Assassination of Abraham Lincoln, March 18, 1865, Ford's Theater Playbill. Booth's last acting appearance. On April 12, 1865, after hearing the news that Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Booth told Louis J. Weichman, a friend of John Surratt, and a boarder at Mary Surratt's house, that he was done with the stage and that the only play he wanted to present henceforth was Venice for the Preservation D. Weichman did not understand the reference. Venice for the Preservation D is about an assassination plot. With the Union Army's capture of Richmond and Lee's surrender, Booth's scheme to kidnap Lincoln was no longer feasible, and he changed his goal to assassination. 90. The previous day, Booth was in the crowd outside the White House when Lincoln gave an impromptu speech from his window. When Lincoln stated that he was in favor of granting suffrage to the former slaves, Booth declared that it would be the last speech Lincoln would ever make. 89. 91, 92. On the morning of Good Friday, April 14, 1865, Booth went to Ford's Theater to get his mail. While there he was told by John, Ford's brother, that President and Mrs. Lincoln accompanied by General and Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant would be attending the play Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that evening. 93. He immediately set about making plans for the assassination, which included making arrangements with livery stable owner James W. Pumphrey for a getaway horse, and an escape route. Booth informed Powell, Harold, and Atzerodt of his intention to kill Lincoln. He assigned Powell to assassinate Secretary of State William H. Seward and Atzerodt to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. Harold would assist in their escape into Virginia. 94. Currier and Ives' depiction of Lincoln's assassination. L2R, Major Rathbone, Clara Harris, Mary Todd Lincoln, President Lincoln and Booth. By targeting Lincoln and his two immediate successors to the presidency, Booth seems to have intended to decapitate the Union government and throw it into a state of panic and confusion. 95. The possibility of assassinating the Union Army's commanding general as well was foiled when Grant declined the theater invitation at his wife's insistence. Instead, the Grants departed Washington by train that evening for a visit to relatives in New Jersey. 29. Booth had hoped that the assassinations would create sufficient chaos within the Union that the Confederate government could reorganize and continue the war if one Confederate army remained in the field or, that failing, to avenge the South's defeat. 96. In his 2005 analysis of Lincoln's assassination, Thomas Goodrich wrote, "All the elements in Booth's nature came together at once: his hatred of tyranny, his love of liberty, his passion for the stage, his sense of drama, and his lifelong quest to become immortal." 97. As a famous and popular actor who had frequently performed at Ford's Theater, and who was well known to its owner, John T. Ford, Booth had free access to all parts of the theater, even having his mail sent there. 98. By boring a spy hole into the door of the presidential box earlier that day, the assassin could check that his intended victim had made it to the play and observe the box's occupants. That evening, at around 10 p.m., as the play progressed, John Wilkes Booth slipped into Lincoln's box and shot him in the back of the head with a .44 caliber Derringer. 99. Booth's escape was almost thwarted by Major Henry Rathbone, who was present in the presidential box with Mrs. Mary Todd Lincoln. 100. Booth stabbed Rathbone when the startled officer lunged at him. 78. Rathbone's fiancée, Clara Harris, who was also present in the box, was unhurt. Booth then jumped from the president's box to the stage, where he raised his knife and shouted, "Sic semper tyra NNIs, number Latin for, thus always to tyrants," attributed to Brutus at Caesar's assassination, and the Virginia state motto number, while others said he added, "I have done it, the South is avenged." 37. 101. 102. Various accounts state that Booth injured his leg when his spur snagged a decorative U.S. Treasury Guard flag while leaping to the stage. 103. Historian Michael W. Kaufman questioned this legend in his book, American Brutus, John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln Conspiracies, writing in 2004 that eyewitness accounts of Booth's hurried stage exit made it unlikely that his leg was broken then. Kaufman contends that Booth was injured later that night during his flight to escape when his horse tripped and fell on him, calling Booth's claim to the contrary an exaggeration to portray his own actions as heroic. 104. Booth was the only one of the assassins to succeed. Powell was able to stab Seward, who was bedridden as a result of an earlier carriage accident. Although badly wounded, Seward survived. Atzerodt lost his nerve and spent the evening drinking. He never made an attempt on Johnson's life. Reaction and pursuit in the ensuing pandemonium. Death. The porch of the Garrett farmhouse, where Booth died in 1865. Guns in Booth's possession when he was captured/killed. Conger tracked down Jet and interrogated him, learning of Booth's location at the Garrett farm. Before dawn on April 26, the soldiers caught up with the fugitives, who were hiding in Garrett's tobacco barn. David Harold surrendered, but Booth refused Conger's demand to surrender, saying, "I prefer to come out and fight." The soldiers then set the barn on fire. 141 As Booth moved about inside the blazing barn, Sergeant Boston Corbett shot him. According to Corbett's later account, he fired at Booth because the fugitive raised his pistol to shoot at them. 141 Conger's report to Stanton, however, stated that Corbett shot Booth without order, pretext, or excuse, and recommended that Corbett be punished for disobeying orders to take Booth alive. 141 Booth, fatally wounded in the neck, was dragged from the barn to the porch of Garrett's farmhouse, where he died 3 hours later, aged 26. 136 The bullet had pierced 3 vertebrae and partially severed his spinal cord, paralyzing him. 140 In his dying moments, he reportedly whispered, "Tell my mother I died for my country." 136. 140 Asking that his hands be raised to his face so he could see them, Booth uttered his last words, "Useless, useless," and died as dawn was breaking. 140. 142 In Booth's pockets were found a compass, a candle, pictures of 5 women number actresses Alice Gray, Helen Western, Effie German, Fanny Brown, and Booth's fiancée Lucy Hale number, and his diary, where he had written of Lincoln's death, "Our country owed all her troubles to him, and God simply made me the instrument of his punishment." 143. Shortly after Booth's death, his brother Edwin wrote to his sister Asia, "Think no more of him as your brother, he is dead to us now, as he soon must be to all the world, but imagine the boy you love to be in that better part of his spirit, in another world." 144 Asia also had in her possession a sealed letter Booth had given her in January 1865 for safekeeping, only to be opened upon his death. 145 In the letter, Booth had written, "I know how foolish I shall be deemed for undertaking such a step as this, where, on one side, I have many friends and everything to make me happy, to give up all, seems insane, but God is my judge. I love justice more than I do a country that disowns it, more than fame or wealth." 79. Booth's letter, seized along with other family papers at Asia's house by federal troops and published by the New York Times while the manhunt was underway, explained his reasons for plotting against Lincoln. In it he said, "I have ever held the South was right. The very nomination of Abraham Lincoln, 4 years ago, spoke plainly war upon Southern rights and institutions." 146 The institution of African slavery, he had written, is one of the greatest blessings that God has ever bestowed upon a favored nation, and Lincoln's policy was one of total annihilation. Aftermath, the historic site marker on U.S. Route 301 near Port Royal, where the Garrett barn and farmhouse once stood in what is now the highway's median. Booth's body was shrouded in a blanket and tied to the side of an old farm wagon for the trip back to Belle Plaine. 147 There, his corpse was taken aboard the ironclad USS Montauk and brought to the Washington Navy Yard for identification and an autopsy. The body was identified there as Booth's by more than 10 people who knew him. 148 Among the identifying features used to make sure that the man that was killed was Booth was a tattoo on his left hand with his initials JWB, and a distinct scar on the back of his neck. 149 The third, fourth, and fifth vertebrae were removed during the autopsy to allow access to the bullet. These bones are still on display at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. 150 The body was then buried in a storage room at the old penitentiary, later moved to a warehouse at the Washington Arsenal on October 1, 1867. 151 In 1869, the remains were once again identified before being released to the Booth family, where they were buried in the family plot at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, after a burial ceremony conducted by Fleming James, minister of Christ Episcopal Church, in the presence of more than 40 people. 151, 152, 153. 154. By then, wrote scholar Russell Conwell after visiting homes in the vanquished former Confederate states, hatred of Lincoln still smoldered, and photographs of Wilkes Booth, with the last words of great martyrs printed upon its borders, adorned their drawing rooms. 115. 8 others implicated in Lincoln's assassination were tried by a military tribunal in Washington, D.C., and found guilty on June 30, 1865. 155. Mary Surratt, 156. Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were hanged in the Old Arsenal Penitentiary on July 7, 1865. 157. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Laughlin were sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Jefferson in Florida's Dry Tortugas. Edmund Spangler was given a 6-year term in prison. 73. O'Laughlin died in a yellow fever epidemic there in 1867. The others were eventually pardoned in February 1869 by President Andrew Johnson. 158. 40 years later, when the centenary of Lincoln's birth was celebrated in 1909, a border state official reflected on Booth's assassination of Lincoln. Confederate veterans held public services and gave public expression to the sentiment. Aftermath. The historic site marker on U.S. Route 301 near Port Royal, where the Garrett Barn and farmhouse once stood in what is now the highway's median, Booth's body was shrouded in a blanket and tied to the side of an old farm wagon for the trip back to Belle Plaine. 147. There, his corpse was taken aboard the ironclad USS Montauk and brought to the Washington Navy Yard for identification and an autopsy. The body was identified there as Booth's by more than 10 people who knew him. 148. Among the identifying features used to make sure that the man that was killed was Booth was a tattoo on his left hand with his initials JWB, and a distinct scar on the back of his neck. 149. The third, fourth, and fifth vertebrae were removed during the autopsy to allow access to the bullet. These bones are still on display at the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Washington, D.C. 150. The body was then buried in a storage room at the old penitentiary, later moved to a warehouse at the Washington Arsenal on October 1, 1867. 151. In 1869, the remains were once again identified before being released to the Booth family, where they were buried in the family plot at Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, after a burial ceremony conducted by Fleming James, minister of Christ Episcopal Church, in the presence of more than 40 people. 151, 152, 153. 154. By then, wrote scholar Russell Conwell after visiting homes in the vanquished former Confederate states, hatred of Lincoln still smoldered, and photographs of Wilkes Booth, with the last words of great martyrs printed upon its borders, adorned their drawing rooms. 115. 8 others implicated in Lincoln's assassination were tried by a military tribunal in Washington, D.C., and found guilty on June 30, 1865. 155. Mary Surratt, 156. Lewis Powell, David Harold, and George Atzerodt were hanged in the Old Arsenal Penitentiary on July 7, 1865. 157. Samuel Mudd, Samuel Arnold, and Michael O'Laughlin were sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Jefferson in Florida's Dry Tortugas. Edmund Spangler was given a 6-year term in prison. 73. O'Laughlin died in a yellow fever epidemic there in 1867. The others were eventually pardoned in February 1869 by President Andrew Johnson. 158. 40 years later, when the centenary of Lincoln's birth was celebrated in 1909, a border state official reflected on Booth's assassination of Lincoln. Confederate veterans held public services and gave public expression to the sentiment. that, had Lincoln lived, the days of Reconstruction might have been softened, and the era of good feeling ushered in earlier. 115 A century later, Goodrich concluded in 2005, for millions of people, particularly in the South, it would be decades before the impact of the Lincoln assassination began to release its terrible hold on their lives. 159 The majority of Northerners viewed Booth as a madman, or monster, who murdered the savior of the Union, while in the South, many cursed Booth for bringing upon them the harsh revenge of an incensed North instead of the reconciliation promised by Lincoln. 160